So it is my absolute pleasure now to introduce to you our keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker is Dr. Tricia Warby. You will be very familiar with her if you've been part of the community for any length of time. We owe her such a gratitude, a debt of gratitude really, for the work that she has brought to the Chrysalis Effect. She's a trauma release specialist. She's a recoverer herself, so she knows exactly what it feels like to be struggling and to have to give up doing her jobs and the work that she was doing, but is a shining beacon of recovery. She's also an absolutely prolific author, and we will be sharing links to Patricia's brand new book. So honestly, this lady astounds me. Every time I speak to her, she's just tirelessly working on supporting people to understand the role of trauma and the joyful fact that you actually can be released from it so that you can go on to live a healthy and happy life. So Patricia, are you there?
I am here, Elaine. Great. So I'm going to be covering a little bit of my story, just if you don't know how I came to do what I now do, and to show you why I've changed my views completely from what I formerly understood. But I will try and keep it brief because it's not my story that's really the important factor here. I'm going to take you through a brief history of medical understanding because I want you to understand why we are where we are with current medicine. And I'm going to go into detail comparing and contrasting the old versus the new paradigm of health and healing, which I've straddled and now fully kind of converted to. And I'm going to dial in on how we can use a new biological understanding to reinvent health. So it's not about abandoning the biology, it's about changing and adapting our new understanding of a quantum universe. And so it is about uniting both the biological with the spiritual and showing you some of the tools to create a new consciousness which actually creates health. And I hope to introduce that to you. But a little warning here. Some of what I'm about to say is very controversial, quite mind-bending in some ways, and contrary to everything you previously believed about yourself and the world you live in. So hold on to your seats. I'm about to get quite controversial. But I want to take you back in time. This is me, age about, I don't know, 22, something like that, 23 maybe, bless her. I believed science could change the world. I was very passionate. And after university degrees in biochemistry and physiology, I wanted to learn from the best. So here I was on my sort of career trajectory. I went to work in a London research hospital. I actually went to Hammersmith Hospital muscular dystrophy unit. Muscular dystrophy is a disease that affects primarily boys, but it's life-limiting and genetic as far as we were concerned. I then went on to work in medical education, both at the University of Southampton and also University of Southampton Hospitals Trust, the Medical Research Council, which is part of the Wellcome Trust now. And I was involved in a longitudinal study, as they call them, ones that track people in time, of the Southampton Women's Survey, which looks at the effect of birth, pregnancy and birth on children as they grow, and looking at their adult experience, which at the time I didn't realize would have such an impact to me and such an impact on my understanding later on when I came upon trauma and adverse childhood experiences. I also went to work for a primary care trust, so I saw firsthand how GPs work, and I supported them in doing trials and improving their practice. And my final regular job in science was as a research and development researcher, and I worked on a number of studies in the UK and also across Europe. So those are my credentials, really, the biological credentials, if you like. So I'm not just talking from vague understanding. I'm steeped in the biological understanding. But in truth, what I learned never really satisfied me. It seemed to be missing something. And then when I got ill myself at 34, modern medicine had nothing to offer me. Well, it had plenty to offer me, but nothing that actually worked. And so I had to kind of look elsewhere, much to my, I don't know, shame. I think I was in shame that it didn't work, and I went to a holistic medicine approach, but purely through desperation, not through any belief whatsoever in that alternative world. And now hang my head, because that's when my education really began. And so that's really why I am doing what I do now, is because I have both in my DNA, if you like. And I studied massage first of all, then EFT, emotional freedom technique, or tapping. I did clinical hypnotherapy degrees, and I've even done somatic trauma release more recently using EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I'm now, of course, you know, an advanced C practitioner specializing in CFS ME. And I should have also put in there long COVID, because long COVID shares a lot of similar traits. Now, I want to take you through a brief history of medicine. And obviously, this is very, very, you know, general, but it does show and illustrate the basic points I'm making here. So Middle Ages to the Industrial Revolution. So before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the countryside. You know, towns and cities were not very large. And so people tended to work close to the land with fresh air, water, and locally grown food. The idea of buying, you know, your food from another country or even another area was unknown. And the vast majority of people were subsistence farmers, or the people who supported growing. So people who, you know, worked as farriers, who made things. You know, it was a subsistence existence. And they were usually poor. The vast majority of people were poor. You didn't have a vast middle class. You had the landed gentry, and you had the rest of us. And lives were hard and short. Physical exhaustion burnt out bodies quite quickly, because it's unbelievable, but people tended to exert themselves much, much more than we do now, and probably ate double the calories that we do. And most people, I've said here everyone, but it was kind of, most people believed in God as the arbiter or judge of your life, and religious observance was mandatory. So, you know, you didn't have a voice if you didn't believe in God, and God was a judgmental presence in your life. It was a way of keeping people in check, if you like, and controlling, I suppose, their behaviors. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, people were crammed into cities with poor sanitation and hygiene. And these overcrowded conditions led to high infection rates from untreated sewage and poor food and ale. Now, ale was not what we think of beer now. It was a fermented water, and it was the only source of fluid for many people, certainly poor people, because water generally in cities was very, very polluted from sewage. So alcoholism and domestic violence were very, very rife, because people were suddenly, for the first time in their lives, cut off from extended family support, or village support, you might even say. And there were long working weeks. I only discovered recently by watching a program on TV that most people worked 6 days a week, and only Sundays were free for religious observance. Saturday working, half day working only came in the mid-19th century. And so poor safety within the work environment also meant large numbers of injuries and death. So that was common. And infectious diseases flourished, as I said. 1 in 3 children died before the age of 5 in 1800. Isn't that extraordinary? And that's probably why we see the average age often quoted as 40, you know, when you look at the average age of the population at that time. And that's largely skewed by these high deaths early on in life. And science, as it was then, was just coming in around just before the time of the Industrial Revolution. And it was practiced by natural philosophers because training and education in science was just rare. It was really only for monks or people in religious communities. And so the idea of natural philosophy was born, and people like René Descartes and Newton were largely self-taught. They came through some of the universities, but they really developed their understanding and their ideas from their own learning. And actually, we still have the idea of PhD is a doctorate in philosophy. That's where that comes from. So that's quite interesting. And of course, it's based on this separation between mind and body. And René Descartes actually is memorialized in the term the Cartesian split, which is where we regard mind and body as separate. I talked about that before because he made a sort of pact with the Pope at the time, and science was to take the body and religion was to have the mind. And we see that mind-body split still in medical training. And prior to the work of Louis Pasteur, it was believed that bad air or miasmas cause disease. But with the advent of the first microscopes, Pasteur was able to identify these tiny organisms that can't be seen by the naked eye, which he called bacteria, and he proposed they caused disease. And this was the birth of germ theory. And now medical science takes on germ theory as the only model, but it's only partially correct, because germ theory misses out entirely the nature of the body hosting the bacteria, which we now term the terrain. And that's from the French word. And so medicine went down this route of attacking germs as the route to health, which I guess makes sense when the majority of your diseases are infectious. And certainly war and poverty created many infectious epidemics. We have obviously the two world wars, and particularly the Spanish flu epidemic, which followed World War I, which embedded the ideas of germs being dangerous. And this is the basis of the infectious disease model. And before 1950, in fact, most medicine was practiced holistically by a variety of people. So you would have a number of people you would go to. And although some of the techniques were rudimentary, you would be treated with a variety. And so maybe herbal medicine, homeopathy, and even bloodletting, which was common, because drugs at that time were very, very limited. And in the UK, which obviously I know best, but I'm sure it's true of most Western nations, medical treatment was very expensive and thus reserved for the upper classes and the male breadwinners in poorer families. Okay, so this is a very important point. If you have limited income, you are going to prioritize the people that bring in the income. And so there was much suffering amongst the poor generally, but particularly women and many children who often did not survive childbirth. Women often died in childbirth. It was quite common. Childbed or puerperal fever was actually spread by doctors moving from patient to patient. Sometimes they'd have done an operation before they moved to deliver a baby. And because they didn't hand wash between patients, they actually spread the disease. And they were very shocked when it was suggested they needed to wash their hands. And in fact, they rallied against that for a number of years until it was finally proven that the rates improved hugely when cleanliness improved. So it was a tough life. And after World War II, there was an impetus to create a better world. And that was part of what launched the NHS, the National Health Service. The Attlee government wanted to create a health service free to all at the point of need. But it was based on this infectious disease model, which aimed to cater to acute illness because chronic conditions at that time were rare. In fact, there were a few chronic conditions. Gout and diabetes were known, but actually they were more diseases of the rich who ate more processed, refined foods. And so it was a very different situation to what we have now. And then bringing you into the 20th century, Rockefeller and the birth of Big Pharma. Okay, so this is a picture of Rockefeller, and John D. Rockefeller was a US oil magnate, and he made himself the first billionaire, actually, and he established a foundation which he claimed it was to promote the well-being of mankind throughout the world, the Rockefeller Foundation. But his vision, although seemingly philanthropic, was actually devoted to creating profit for the new petrochemical industry, which he largely owned. He owned all of the petrochemical industry at the time. And so there's actually a link here to a fuller history of that, which I'll maybe send on afterwards. So huge profits could be made if the chemicals from this industry could be redeployed to treat disease. But in the US, at least, and certain parts of Europe, natural medicine was still very popular. And certainly in the US, the Native American traditions still used natural medicine. And so it was considered a threat to the profit of this emerging industry. So Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who was a similar, oil, he was in steel, he was a steel magnate. They got together and they planned an attack on what they called quack medicine. So, and their idea was to control what was taught in medical schools to be solely pharmaceutical and surgical. And so to eliminate the threat of natural medicine. And holistic doctors were systematically vilified, jailed sometimes, but they were certainly put out of business. And to cement that, these two magnates, they commissioned a report called the Flexner Report, which basically set out to attack even highly scientifically trained doctors who happened to use the new emerging science of electrostimulation. And they were eradicated too. So yes, it probably did get rid of a few quacks. Undoubtedly, there were men who toured, from state to state with kind of snake oil salesmen, we call them, touting various cures and so on, who were ultimately selling, things that didn't work. So yes, it was a good idea in one sense, but on the other hand, it got rid of a huge wealth of experience and maybe set back medical technology for about 60 years. And at the same time, moves were afoot in industrialized nations to use the vast reserves of chemicals that were developed to serve the war effort. Now, when the war ended, we still had vast reserves of chemicals that were unused for ammunitions. And so these actually became the basis of pesticides and fertilizers to boost food production after the war. And what does that do? Well, what that does is by the 1970s and 80s, we have industrialized agriculture, where we're using tons and tons of chemicals which are added to the soil, given to livestock, and sprayed on crops to improve production. As intensification, this idea that we want to get more and more out of the land, continued. And as that happened, a new class of disease began to take hold. And this is chronic or long-term conditions such as asthma, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. Big Pharma was evolving at the same time to produce drugs to treat this new class of disease, and funding the medical schools that taught these new treatments to doctors. Now, I know that firsthand. I was in a medical school. I saw it evolving. And rates continued to climb. And as we can see here from this little graph, you can see from, this just takes us from 1940 to 2020, but you can see the inexorable rise of chronic disease from 7.5% of diseases in just before 1940 to 60% of diseases. Now I'm sure it's even gone up in 2023. And then the Gates Foundation began its philanthropic mission of eradicating infectious disease in what they called the third world, you know, the undeveloped nations, via vaccines and pharmaceuticals, which make huge profits. Now, my question to you is, does that sound familiar? I shall say no more. And then governmental organizations like the CDC in America and the WHO were infiltrated by industry-sponsored people to pass laws that benefited Big Pharma. Now, that's a controversial statement, but it's still happening. All right. The former UK Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, is now at Moderna. Now he was promoting the vaccines, and now he's working for the company. And this is the so-called revolving door between government, regulators, and Big Pharma. And it's a really important source of how Big Pharma have become so dominant, because they control the organizations that control them. And the COVID pandemic was fought as a war against the virus. Did you notice that? A lot of the terminology, a lot of the posturing, a lot of the language, and it's very much pure germ theory, and huge profits were made. I don't think anyone can deny that now. And chronic disease is still seen as the poor relation in healthcare. Although there have been recent moves to make CFS and ME more accepted as a real disease. We've actually had a government report not so long ago. And this is, I think, partly come about because of long COVID, because of the raising of awareness of people getting this long-term chronic condition, despite being, quote unquote, healthy before. But there have been revolutionaries who show us another way. And obviously, I can't show you everyone that's contributed to this idea. I'm just going to take 6 people that I think have made a contribution and have influenced me. Dr. Candice Pert, sadly no longer with us, wrote a book, Molecules of Emotion. And she was a researcher, and she found out that your microbiome and your cells are in a dance of mutual support and communication. This is a communication network in your body via peptides, little molecules, and other metabolites, which they secrete to modulate and inform your responses to your emotions. So emotions are so much more than feelings. They're physiological regulators. So that was a really important book. And then there's Dr. Bruce Lipton, The Biology of Belief. The unconscious beliefs you hold change your biology away from repair towards breakdown. And disease occurs via shifts in the cell membrane transduction. So in other words, what goes across the cell membrane, charge, electrical charge, proteins, metabolites, information that passes across the membrane. It turns out that the cell membrane is the brains of the cell, not the nucleus as previously believed, you know. So just because the DNA was in the nucleus, we assumed it was the brains of the cell, but it turns out it's what goes in and out. It's the communication that creates the information in the cell. And then there's Dawson Church, the genie in your genes. He first brought to our attention the idea that your genes are not fixed. They are controlled by certain biological switches, and this is called epigenetics. And so your genes are actually responding to your life. They are an expression of your life, beliefs, and habits. And so if you have certain patterns of behaving and believing, your genes are read out according to that. And then there is one of my favorite human beings of all time. I happen to have met him, which is amazing. Dr. Gabor Mate. Now, I know Elaine's recently been on a conference where he attended. So he wrote an extraordinary book. He's written many, but the first book that I read of his was The Body Says No. And this was about the impact of stress in the body and how it's stored in various ways, causing physical and mental illness. And so his idea was really that the body speaks what you cannot. So if you know, you have been limited in how you were able to express yourself, for instance, either by your beliefs or your parental beliefs or the experiences you had growing up, your body will express itself in ways that are destructive. And then there was Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a Dutchman. The body keeps the score. Now, this was my initiation into trauma, I guess. Well, certainly the understanding of trauma. I'd already been initiated by what happened to me with clients. But his idea was that what happens to you in childhood is expressed through the body in adulthood. And in other words, trauma lives on in you, and specifically in your body. Now, he wrote that book in 2015, and it came out 1 month before I was due to write my book. And so I've added mine, not out of pride, but just to say it changed the way I wrote this book, The Scar That Won't Heal, because I decided not just to write about trauma and how it's expressed in the body, but to look at how ordinary childhoods, like quote unquote, non-abusive childhoods, can also contain trauma, and how it creates chronic disease by changes to the brain and nervous system. And I based it on my own history because I felt that was the one I knew best, and I could explain very clearly how my childhood had impacted me. And so that was the first chapter of the book, and it was extraordinary because that's the first chapter that most people read in a initial sitting, and I often get people still saying how it resonates with them. So what we're looking at here is the old paradigm versus the new, and I'm calling it the transition from the biological machine model to a mind-body perspective. And medicine was driven by this isolationist perspective. It's a very Victorian value that we're all individually powerless to change ourselves. And should disease strike, we must give over our power to experts, and that's doctors and the health service, who will fix us like a mechanic fixes our car. It's a machine model. The other idea is that we have no responsibility for our health because we can't fix ourselves. We can't change or fix that. And we fear disease ultimately, but we feel powerless and dissociated from our bodies. And so we have this double whammy of feeling powerless and also in fear. And so to develop these ideas further, I thought it'd be interesting to compare and contrast the old model with the new model. So the old model, the body is a complex biological machine which can only be understood logically. It's physical only, and once we understand its parts, the organs and tissues, we dissect it down and we reduce it to its parts, we can then manipulate it biochemically. Illness is a breakdown of the machine led by random fate. In other words, the modern idea is genetics. Genetics are just the modern version of God's will. And if you don't have an overt disease, then you are healthy. That's the old model. The new model says the body is a complex, holistic system, not parts. And dis-ease is a manifestation of a dysfunctional system. And epigenetics tells us that the readout of the environment is key, i.e., it's a biopsychosocial dysfunction. Health is a continuum. You're always on a spectrum depending on the terrain you create by your thoughts, beliefs, and habits. So, though I would say today I'm feeling fairly healthy, I couldn't claim absolute health because I'm on a spectrum, and I'm sure you are too. And we move across the spectrum depending on what's happening in our lives. And so this idea that we are powerless and we have to consult experts, having no responsibility because we can't change the hand we have been dealt. And we see that a lot in this genetic determinism idea. You have a breast cancer gene, you must have your breast removed to prevent disease. It makes no account of the life that you're living. And now we know that we can change our biology by changing our beliefs, thoughts, and habits. And we are the experts in our own mind bodies. And we have tremendous power to embody health, particularly with chronic disease, of course. We ultimately have the responsibility to change the output towards health by listening to our body's messages with compassion and awareness. I'm going to be coming on to this in a moment. So compassion and awareness. So to not be afraid of our body's messages. So symptoms are not necessarily something to be afraid of, they're something to listen to. And the other old idea is that mind is purely the function of the biological activity of the brain. It's a meta function of all those neuronal impulses. And it has no external validity. It's limited to the brain it's housed in. And you're born with all the neurons or nerve cells you'll ever have, and they gradually decay throughout life for unknown reasons, and therefore disease is inevitable and to be managed. That's a message of despair, if ever I heard one. The new concept is that mind is a non-local concept. It's not limited to space or time. I'm not going to get into deep quantum physics here, but that's where it comes from. It's actually a hologram of universal consciousness. It's a download, if you like, a reflection of the universal understanding that's already there, the information that's present in the universe in which we're embedded. And it's independent of the brain. And brain neuroplasticity, which is the term given to how the brain adapts to its environment, occurs throughout life, not just when we're first born, but throughout our lives. We can adapt our neurology to our environment. And therefore, we can intervene to prevent and reverse disease. And that's a message of hope. So this idea that we are isolated, discrete individuals, only shaped by the effects of our own life experiences, maybe a random, uncontrollable combination of fate and circumstance, is being challenged now. The idea that we're physical beings only who live and then die, and there's nothing beyond death, therefore we need to fear it, which so much of our health service is about the fear of death, and live disconnected and unfeeling in our own bodies. And that's where I was at before I found this new idea and put these practices into my life. The new idea says that we're not just limited by ourselves, it's also our ancestors' experiences which also shape who we are via epigenetic transmission of DNA expression. And this has only recently been found, you know, but it can go down 3 to 6 generations. So if your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents had stress in their lives, it changes the way your DNA expresses itself. And that largely is transmitted through the microbes that live in and on us, the microbiome, and they affect our life choices because they change the way our bodies, as particularly our brains, work. And we are energetic beings first, whose consciousness lives on beyond death. I had first-hand experience of this after my mum passed recently. To my great surprise, it was possible to connect with her consciousness, and I got lots of messages from her. So that really, really turned upside down what I previously believed. So as consciousness continues beyond death, we can enjoy fully embodied lives in our bodies right here, right now. And so, you know, there is a hidden harmony of life. And all our previous models of the mind and body, which have relied on observation of dead material or cells isolated in a petri dish, are largely inaccurate. Only recently have we been able to observe how cells interact in live bodies or see how brain waves change in living beings. And so the major discoveries of our time are that fascia, which is a connective tissue throughout your body, is a liquid crystal matrix, which links every tissue communicating stress or relaxation depending on what you're feeling. And the microbiome constitutes a community of us. We're not an I. Even our mitochondria contribute to this. And this is a major factor in the environmental response and the energy available for life. And you may or may not know, mitochondrial DNA continually swaps information into and out of nuclear DNA, that's our DNA, and so is an information transducer, not just an energy factory. And our DNA, long thought of as this beautiful double helix structure, isn't static. It resonates at different frequencies depending on our emotional state. How amazing is that? And so you can change your DNA by changing your emotional state. And so emotional healing can actually be expressed through the DNA vibration. Everything you see is in resonance. It moves, it vibrates. And resonance is the basis of the universe, and it comes before any physical manifestation. And so if you're resonating with hope and gratitude rather than fear and despair, you change the trajectory of your life. And so I like to think of it as the golden thread, really. And I think it isolates really what was missing from all my very expensive university education. The mind and the body are not separate. And what we think and feel impacts the body, and what our bodies report back changes how we feel via nerve transmission, hormones, and our genetic expression. But they're not the whole story, because nerves and hormones and genetic expression are too slow in response to explain how we function. How do dancers coordinate? How do we pick up information from other people without verbal communication? How do we have near-death experiences? No one can explain these things by nerve transmission alone. We have to move to a much more quantum understanding, because fast communication is a quantum effect. It's coming into effect now through quantum computing, but it also exists in the body, and it uses virtually instantaneous signaling. It's something called non-local transmission, and it occurs via the microbiome, the mitochondria, fascia, and DNA expression. DNA is an amazing molecule. I went on a fantastic conference the last weekend about DNA and how it changes its formation through this kind of emotional and physical resonance. Now, unfortunately, this is largely ignored by modern medicine, which has gone down the pharmaceutical and surgical route, and it leaves people in fear of symptoms and without access to their own body's wisdom. And that's a major lack, actually. And I just want to talk about why is it some people get sick and others don't, because you may have observed we're not all the same, and some of us seem more prone to chronic disease than others. And largely, do you know what's missing? Emotions. The missing link for me, it was the final missing link in my healing, is emotional, because emotions are vibrations too, and they change our physiology. As I said earlier, they're not just feelings, they have an information flow to them. And this diagram kind of shows you from shame, guilt, and grief and fear, all the way up to love and joy and peace. Hugely expanded vibration. And of course, your past experience informs how you feel. So the understanding of adverse childhood experience, or ACEs, which, by the way, is anything that causes you emotional overwhelm, changes our brain via this neuroplasticity to react more strongly to stress. And we are therefore sensitized to stress and to perceiving the world in ways which enhance breakdown and facilitate disease. And the other thing I want to really highlight is that some people are highly sensitive. Highly sensitive people, or HSPs, are sensitized even by relatively normal childhoods, because their emotional needs are much higher and they're processing slower. And the stress response, therefore, is enacted much more frequently. And that's something that I looked at more recently in, as Elaine mentioned, my latest book, The Highly Sensitive Handbook. And so how that plays out, by the way, is that it affects your ability to handle change. And so even if you get dietary changes or you take new supplements, it actually, your body will reject that as a stress. And so one of the first signs I see with highly sensitive people is their intolerance to changes in their biochemistry. And so the microbiome and mitochondria, are so important, and they're mostly missing from medical understanding, even though it's in all the literature. The idea that you're a we, not an I, and that the microbial community lives on you and creates the chemical signature of health or disease is largely missing, which is a shame, because mitochondria and microbes are single-celled organisms, and they're able to respond much more quickly to your environment than anything in your cells would do otherwise. And so their balance is crucial. And they respond to toxins in your environment, and the toxins are both physical and mental, emotional. We can talk about toxic thoughts, toxic feelings. So your mitochondria are picking up your environment and transmitting that message throughout your body. I've talked about that before. Here's a mitochondrion. You can see it looks remarkably like a bacterium. It's the same shape as a bacterium. It has these inner membranes which allow energy formation. There are many, many of them in each cell, and they are absolutely vital to how you feel. And actually, they are part of what we call the healing cycle. This was developed by a researcher called Robert Navio, and he talked about normal health is a cycle of restorative sleep and adaptation and recovery overnight from the experiences you've had in the day, digesting your food, all the experiences that you need to digest, both mental and physical. And that's the normal health cycle. But if you get a stress in the cycle, this sets in motion, I sometimes called the cell danger response, but I prefer to call it the healing cycle. And so you see mitochondria being bacterial in origin. I think 200,000 years ago, they reckon, a bacterium first fused with an animal cell to give us efficient energy. So respiration rather than fermentation. And that allowed humans, as we now are, to evolve. But they're still really, really important. And what you feel and think impacts them. And they change their function according to what's going on to downregulate energy production to protect the cell from damage by toxic stress or even an infection. That's why people often feel worse for a while if they get an infection. It can affect not only their physical strength, but their mood. And this is the cell danger response. This is this diagram here, and it has to go in this order. It has to go from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3. I've done other talks about that. So symptoms that you get in this healing cycle are signs that your body is trying to heal you. It's trying to take you around this cycle back to health. And so if we understand that, we fear them less, and we can maybe understand what's going on. And I describe that in much more detail in The World Within, which, by the way, is about to be republished as the human superorganism. I finally got a publisher interested, so they didn't like the title, sadly. But I'm hopefully about to be publishing that at Christmas. But you can still find it on Amazon. So how about, what can we do about this now? Understanding who we are and why we're here and why we do have power, how do we change our DNA expression? Well, the first thing I would say is get out of your heads and into your heart. This over-analyzing or trying to fix the problem of your health is a doing state, and it's stressful. It's distrustful of your own body's innate intelligence. It's despairing because you're getting all these messages from the health service, which is really a disease service, and you are in fear, and that embeds the problem in your body. And so this idea of needing to control or regiment or fix can often be from repressed anger, actually, in yourself. And we even see it in religions, we see it in science itself, which is very dogmatic at the moment and very fixed. And even in alternative medical worlds, the biohacking movement, okay, which seeks to identify the problem and fix the problem. We need to move to a feeling state away from a a thinking state. So a state of being in your body, which is heart-based, which is knowing, which is allowing, which changes your experience of yourself. And I often say it's like clearing out your mental garbage, which is your trauma, is your emotional overwhelm that you experienced when you were young. And this changes your DNA expression to a healing and repair state, as it reflects a sense of unity and oneness, which is something we all need to kind of reflect on, I think. We are linked with everyone. We are not single, unique. We are unique, but we're not unlinked to everything else. And so this idea that we are linked to everyone who went before us and everyone around us is really the understanding I want to move you to. And there's so much information out there now about this, not just from the spiritual community, but from science itself. And one of the most foundational understandings I've come across recently is the gene keys, which looks at DNA patterns, if you like, and resonance patterns and what you inherit and how you express that. You could say the Enneagram is similar, if you've ever come across the Enneagram. But we express ourselves as the patterns that we have inherited and the patterns that we are running as habits in our lives. This new paradigm that we're in is that consciousness is primary and it gives rise to matter, not the other way around. Consciousness isn't a result of our brain activity. Our brains download the consciousness that is around us. And actually, we can change the reality that we witness through our DNA, which is vibrational and fractal, self-similar. And so focusing first on the well-being of the soul, not the symptoms of the body, is just so, so important. And I would try to move you from clinging to the preferred outcome of fixing the problem. I want to be well, I want to be back to work. Of course you do. Of course you do. I dreamed of that when I was lying in bed. But actually, you need to focus on the process of connecting to your body. And I like to say, let go to get well, let go of the fixing mentality. Healing is a process, not an event. There's never a time when you will be healed completely and that's it, and there's nothing more to do. It's a process, it's a learning. And symptoms are your body's messages for you to listen. And it's iterative, it's self-learning, it's a system. And here's a little diagram. Sorry you can't see it terribly well, but the healing occurs not as a straight line. When you're stuck, you're sort of going between the sort of boom and bust. You feel better some days and you overdo it and you go back down. And then there's a turning point. There's something that comes into your life, whether that's a person that you're working with or an understanding that you reach, or maybe you're lucky enough to be able to heal your body through nutrition. Whatever it is, it could be a combination of things. You start on this healing process, and so you still get ups and downs, everyone. You'll have things that will knock you back again, but you'll know not to fear your body, you'll know to listen, and that's when the process continues on, and until these kind of ups and downs get less and less, and you're into a more stable area. And so this is a heart-centered experience which starts at this turning point, whatever that is for you. So the body is fractal, okay? It's self-similar. This is a great picture of the vessels which branch on and on. and that's fractal. And the human heartbeat, even the fractals in time, the human heartbeat is fractal. You see this up and down is reflected in this up and down. And then if we went down into that one, obviously we're limited by the scale of that image, but take my word for it, it's fractal. Time is fractal, and we repeat experiences of betrayal and abandonment, etc., in very distinct patterns. Now, I looked at this from Greg Braden's work, and he's got a lovely fractal time calculator on his website. And this is all until we address our unconscious patterns, okay? So we can change this. We are embedded in nature, okay? We're not separate. But we are unique as human beings because we're right in the middle of the universe in scale. Isn't that astonishing? If you look at the very smallest things to the very largest things, you know, the Planck scale in your quantum mechanics is the smallest thing we know of, and this is kind of the largest thing we know of in the universe, and the human being is right bang in the middle. Okay, and this is a fractal understanding. It's in fact called the fundamental fractal, and it means we have the ability to influence information flow to the smallest to the largest. Isn't that extraordinary? I think it is. And Earth cycles are embedded in us. I mean, today is a new moon. It's also an annular eclipse, interestingly. We are in an interconnected cosmos. You know, this is the signature wobble of the Earth. It's 25,770 years, roughly. And you know, but that's also the same as the number of breaths we take each day. Isn't that extraordinary? We have the most advanced consciousness yet evolved and ability to change the reality. Our universe is not static and predetermined, but it's intelligent and self-learning, and we are part of that unfolding. That's really important. We have to reimagine ourselves as a new version of the human experience or humanity, connected and appreciative of the wonder of the world we live in. And this is what I have turned to. We owe it to ourselves, I think, and future generations to get this right now, because we are at crisis point. There's no denying. And my last slide, folks, spiritual tools for a new imagining of you. And this is thanks to another wonderfully connected and spiritual man, Zach Bush, who I just think is incredible. Board certified in 3 different specialties. He's an MD, but he's sort of like me. He's straddled both sides. And here's his recommendations with a few additions of mine. So feeling alive, okay? Even if you feel ill right now, taking time to really connect with your body as part of nature and the wider world. Who are you? What gives you joy? What's your soul food? These are really important questions, and they mustn't be ignored just because you're suffering physically. You have to engage that self-healing wisdom, which is knowledge applied of being. Beingness is more important than what you did before or what you're planning to do after. Who are you being? And reimagining yourself and refusing to fear age. We all fear age and death, you know. Creating a new thought field. That's kind of when everyone thinks together the same thing, that appreciates the beauty in the finite. Yes, we all die, but shouldn't that be an opportunity to enjoy the life we're living now in all its wonder and variety? And to stop engaging in inflammatory activities. I love the way he described this, inflammatory activities in public discourse. In other words, getting involved on social media and you're wrong and I'm right, and attacking each other and sitting in our little silos where we all agree with each other, but finding inner safety instead by accepting where you are right now and the difference between us. We're not all the same, but that doesn't mean we can't enjoy and communicate. And so becoming part of what he calls a quorum sensing community, you know. This is how bacteria and mitochondria communicate, but so can we. You know, heart-based connection between humans and animals and nature is a real thing. And feeling our way to a new version of a connected, holistic life, which melds the biological with the spiritual. I think that's the way forward. And thank you so much for listening, because you are both welcome and needed here.
Oh, thank you so much, Patricia. That was just absolutely mind-blowing. I'm going to watch that all again. Just fascinating. And I can hear your passion and just seeing your journey through and the way you share everything with us as you are learning and evolving, and how that's impacting every single person in our community. Thank you so much.